Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. Yesterday in Psalm 142, we talked about a person whose soul was imprisoned. And today in Psalm 143, we get to see a person, that is David, whose spirit was overwhelmed. And he even says, my heart is appalled. This is found in verse 4 where he says, therefore my spirit is overwhelmed within me. My heart is appalled within me. He just felt overwhelmed. Yesterday we talked about how a person can feel entrapped. They feel trapped in their circumstances because they don't feel like they could receive any help from others, nor do they feel as though they themselves can help themselves, and they feel trapped. Here we can see that a person might also feel overwhelmed to the point that they feel as though the circumstances have really just flooded them and they just feel drowned in their circumstances, and they just feel overwhelmed as though there's just too much for them. And David definitely felt this way, and it led to his heart being appalled. And of course, there are many times in our lives where we feel this way. There's just too much going on. There's just too much stress, perhaps too much anxiety, too much fear, and we just feel overwhelmed by the things that are happening in our lives, the things that are happening within, and we feel overwhelmed. And what David did in response to the time when he felt overwhelmed is something that we can do as well. There's basically 5 things that he does that is mentioned in verses 5 and 6 that can be practiced by us. For one, he remembered. In the starting of verse 5, he says, I remembered the days of old. He remembered the days in the past, perhaps when God had helped him, when God had delivered him, but also just remembered perhaps the days of old when he was walking in deep fellowship with the Lord. Maybe he can remember those times when he was a shepherd, just shepherding the flock and lifting up his heart to the Lord and spending time with the Lord in fellowship with the Lord. But he just remembered the days of old, and that can help us as well when we feel overwhelmed. To remember back the days of old, to remember that just because our circumstances have changed, still the God that we walked in fellowship with in times past is the same God that is walking with us through the darkness, through the hard times, during the times when we feel overwhelmed. I think he says also, I meditate on all your doings. He meditated on all that God had done in the past. He could think about perhaps the times when God did go or did act on his behalf, and think of all the doings of the Lord that were good and right and just, and the power that God had demonstrated. He could remember when God helped him kill Goliath with just one smooth stone. How he was able to do that, and many other times. And we could do that as well. When we feel overwhelmed, just sit back and meditate on, really think about the times that God has been there for us before. Remember those answered prayers where God came through for us, even when we thought perhaps all was lost. And then he says, I muse on the work of your hands. He thought about God's works, the works of God's hands. And here David could be talking about creation, as he looks at the beauty of creation, looks at nature and sees all that God has crafted and how he's crafted it all in such a beautiful way, but also in a very powerful way. But he also could look to himself, as he talks about in Psalm 139, where he says he is wonderfully and fearfully made. He thought of himself as one who was handcrafted by God. And as he considered creation, when he considered himself, he could see God's handiwork, and that encouraged him in the time when he felt overwhelmed. And of course, these things can help us as well. As we view creation, we look at nature, we even look at ourselves and see how God has, with such wisdom and power, created all these things. It can give us encouragement to know that the God that created all these things is the God that's with me now. And even though I feel overwhelmed, God is not overwhelmed, and he can help. And then he goes on in verse 6 and says, I stretch out my hands to you. Stretching out his hands, that is, after he remembered the days of old, after he remembered what God had done in the past, and he remembered and looked upon and mused over God's works, he stretched out his hands to the Lord. That's a way of really just reaching out to God. This is emphasized in the next thing he does, where he says, my soul longs for you as a parched land. To long for the Lord in those times when we're overwhelmed. Yes, remembering how the Lord has been with us in the past, but presently just stretching out our hands to the Lord, longing for the Lord, and just really falling face first before the Lord, and seeking him, seeking his presence, seeking his present guidance, seeking his strength, and just longing to be with him. That can help us in the times that we're overwhelmed. And then we could mention further down in verse 10, he says, teach me to do your will, for you are my God. It's interesting that David, in all the distress and feeling overwhelmed, when he felt overwhelmed and his heart was appalled within him, he still wanted to obey God. Teach me to do your will. And perhaps that's something that we could walk away with here as well. When we're in those dark times, when we feel overwhelmed, it's not just enough to get through them, but also to do that, still remaining obedient to the Lord, still seeking the Lord's will in that particular situation, and trusting that if we will but obey him and listen to his word, that he can carry us through, and that he's there for us now, just as he's been with us in the past. So you see some things we can reflect on and think about as we do a reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.